The crimson suns have cast long shadows across the crystalline hunting grounds as Young crouched behind a cluster of razor-sharp mineral formations. His scaled hide rippled with nervous energy, amber eyes tracking the movement of his prey through the maze of crystal spires that jutted from the planet's surface like frozen lightning. The creature he stalked was a six-legged beast with armor plating that could deflect plasma bolts and claws capable of shredding. For a cub barely past his first molting, it represented the ultimate test. "We are nothing without the hunt," whispered to himself, repeating the ancient mantra of his people. The words tasted bitter on his forked tongue. 3 times he had attempted this ritual passage, and 3 times he had failed. The elders were beginning to whisper that perhaps Young lacked the killer instinct that defined their warrior race. They had ruled this sector of the galaxy for over 2, their empire built upon the foundation of perfect predation. Every aspect of their society revolved around the hunt. From the moment a cub could walk, they were taught to track, to kill, to dominate. Their ships prowled the star lanes like apex predators. Their armies swept across worlds with the unstoppable force of a hunting pack. To fail at the hunt was to fail at life itself. His claws extended involuntarily as he remembered his father's disappointed growl after the last failure. "Perhaps you are more suited to the scholarly pursuits," and had said, the words cutting deeper than any physical wound. In society, there was no greater insult than to suggest someone belonged among the keepers of knowledge rather than the warriors of the pack. The paused in its grazing, massive head swiveling towards hiding place. The young froze, barely daring to breathe. The beast's sensory organs flared, tasting the air for threats. Had spent weeks studying its patterns, learning its habits, preparing for this moment. Everything depended on patience and timing. But as he waited for the perfect moment to strike, a sound reached his ears that made his blood run cold. The distinctive whine of atmospheric engines cut through the crystal formations. His head snapped up to see a small craft descending from the amber sky, its hull gleaming with an unfamiliar metallic sheen. The ship bore no markings he recognized, and its design was unlike anything in the fleet databases. Scattered at the sound, his carefully planned hunt ruined in an instant. Snarled in frustration, watching weeks of preparation evaporate as the alien vessel settled onto a flat expanse of crystal perhaps 100 meters from his position. As the engines wound down, a hatch opened with a soft hiss, and a figure emerged that made its eyes widen in disbelief. It was bipedal-like but smaller and seemingly fragile. Its skin was pale pink, almost translucent, and it wore simple garments that offered no apparent protection. Most shocking of all, it appeared to have no natural weapons. No claws, no fangs, no armored hide. How such a pathetic creature had managed to master spaceflight was beyond comprehension. The alien began walking directly towards position, moving with a casual confidence that seemed at odds with its apparent vulnerability. Pressed himself deeper into the shadows between the crystals, but the creature continued its approach with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where they were going. "You can come out," the alien called in perfectly accented, its voice carrying clearly across the crystal formations. "I'm not here to interfere with your hunt, young one." His mind reeled. How did this creature know his language? How had it even found him? More importantly, why did it seem completely unafraid despite being clearly outmatched by any, even a failed hunter like himself? After a long moment of internal debate, emerged from his hiding place, keeping his stance low and threatening. "You speak our tongue, alien? How is this possible?" The creature smiled, an expression that seemed strange on its soft features. "I've had good teachers. My name is, and I've come a very long way to meet you." "You know my name?" Claws extended fully, the instinctive response to an unknown threat. "Are you some kind of spy, an assassin sent by our enemies?" Raised his hands in what assumed was a gesture of peace, though the young had never seen anything like it. "Nothing so dramatic. I'm an explorer, you might say, someone who studies different cultures and tries to understand what makes them unique." "Then you have wasted a long journey," spat, his shame at his ruined hunt making him more aggressive than usual. "There is nothing to study here. I'm a failed hunter, a disgrace to my bloodline. You would learn more from watching the wind blow through these crystals." Tilted his head, studying with eyes that seemed far older than his youthful appearance suggested. "Failed hunter? You've been tracking that for 3 weeks, learning its patterns, studying its behavior. You've shown more patience and observation skills than most seasoned hunters twice your age." Blinked in surprise. "You have been watching me." I have, and I've been impressed by what I've seen. Took a step closer, seemingly oblivious to the fact that could tear him apart without effort. Tell me, young hunter, what do you think makes a successful predator? The question caught off guard. It seemed so simple, yet the human's tone suggested there was more to it than appeared. Strength, he answered automatically. Speed, sharp claws and teeth, the will to kill. Those are certainly useful tools, agreed. But they're not what makes a true predator successful. Can I show you something? Before could respond, reached into a pouch on his belt and a small device. He pressed a control, and a holographic display sprang to life between them. The image showed a world didn't recognize, covered in vast grasslands and populated by creatures unlike any he had ever seen. This is where I come from, explained. A world called Earth in a system your people haven't discovered yet. This is the African savanna, one of the birthplaces of my species. The display zoomed in on a group of four-legged creatures with massive teeth and powerful muscles. They were stalking a herd of smaller animals, their approach coordinated and deadly. These are lions, continued. Apex predators by any reasonable measure, stronger than almost anything else on the plains, armed with claws and teeth that can crush bone. Watched with professional interest as the lions began their attack. It was a textbook hunt, executed with the kind of brutal efficiency the valued. But then the display shifted, showing a different scene. And these, said as new figures appeared, are humans. Stared at the creatures on the display. They looked like smaller versions of, just as fragile and apparently defenseless. They carried primitive tools, nothing more advanced than sharpened sticks and shaped stones. Yet as he watched, these seemingly helpless beings began to hunt the same powerful predators that had dominated the previous scene. But they didn't attack directly. Instead, they spread out, using coordination and intelligence to drive their prey toward prepared traps. They showed patience that put even the most disciplined hunter to shame, following their quarry for days across vast distances. When they finally struck, it wasn't with overwhelming force, but with precision and timing that turned their prey's own strength against them. We are persistence hunters, explained as the display showed humans tracking wounded prey across endless miles. We're not the strongest or the fastest, but we never give up. We think, we plan, we adapt. Most importantly, we understand that the greatest weapon isn't claws or teeth, but the ability to outlast your opponent. Found himself leaning forward, fascinated despite himself. But surely raw power must count for something. Your kind would be helpless against a warrior. Smiled again, that strange expression that seemed to hold secrets. Would we? Let me tell you about the first time humans encountered the Empire. The holographic display shifted again, now showing images that made breath catch. Warships in full battle formation, their hulls gleaming with the pride of an empire that had never known defeat. Across from them, a ragtag collection of human vessels that looked primitive and outmatched. This was the Battle of Station about 50 years ago, narrated. First contact between our species. Your people naturally assumed we would be easy prey. After all, we had no claws, no armor, no obvious weapons. Watched in growing amazement as the battle unfolded. The ships attacked with their usual overwhelming force, expecting quick victory. But the humans didn't fight back in any way that made sense. Instead of meeting force with force, they scattered, using hit-and-run tactics that seemed almost cowardly by standards. But as the battle continued, a pattern emerged. The human ships weren't fleeing randomly. They were drawing the fleet into a carefully prepared killing ground, using their enemy's aggression against them. When the trap finally closed, it was the mighty armada that found itself outmaneuvered and defeated. Impossible, breathed. They have never lost a battle. Haven't they? Asked gently. I think you'll find your history books are missing a few chapters. Your people didn't want to admit that a species they considered prey had outsmarted them. The young's world view was crumbling around him. Everything he had been taught about strength and dominance suddenly seemed incomplete. But why are you showing me this? What does it have to do with my failed hunt? Deactivated the holographic display and looked directly into Size. Because I don't think you're a failed hunter at all. I think you're exactly the kind of hunter your people need to become if they want to survive what's coming. What do you mean? The galaxy is changing, young one. The old ways of thinking about predator and prey are becoming obsolete. There are threats emerging that can't be defeated with claws and teeth alone. Your people are going to need hunters who can think, who can adapt, who understand that true strength comes not from individual power, but from working together toward a common goal. Felt a strange stirring in his chest, something he had never experienced before. It wasn't the familiar burn of hunting instinct, but something deeper and more complex. "You speak as if you know something about my future." "I know many things," replied. "I know that you've been having dreams about creatures that hunt between the stars, things that your people's weapons can't touch. I know that you've been questioning whether the old ways are truly the best ways. And I know that you have the potential to become something greater than just another warrior." The human's words hit uncomfortably close to home. Had indeed been having strange dreams, visions of shadow creatures that seemed to devour light itself. He had dismissed them as the products of an anxious mind, but spoke as if they were something more. "How could you possibly know about my dreams?" "Because I've been looking for someone like you for a very long time," said. "Someone with the intelligence to see beyond the surface, the patience to plan rather than simply react, and the courage to question everything they've been taught." A sound in the distance caught their attention. The had returned, apparently drawn by curiosity about the alien vessel. It stood at the edge of the crystal formation, massive and powerful, a perfect representation of everything was supposed to be able to defeat. "There's your quarry," observed calmly. "Still want to complete your hunt." Looked at the beast, then for the first time in his life, the idea of killing the creature seemed almost pointless. What would it prove? That he could overcome a single animal through brute force? That hardly seemed like an achievement worth celebrating. "What would you do?" he asked. The human studied for a long moment. "I'd learn from it. That creature has survived on this harsh world for millions of years by adapting to every challenge nature could throw at it. Its armor isn't just protection, it's also solar collectors that help it maintain body temperature. Its claws aren't just weapons, they're tools for digging to underground water sources. Everything about it serves multiple purposes." Looked at with new eyes, seeing not just a target but a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering. "You're saying I should study it instead of killing it?" "I'm saying you should decide for yourself what would be more valuable. A dead trophy that proves you can overpower something weaker than yourself, or living knowledge that could teach you how to become stronger in ways you never imagined." The choice seemed obvious when put that way, but knew it wasn't really about the at all. It was about who he wanted to be, what kind of hunter he wanted to become. The old path led to a predictable future as just another warrior, assuming he could even complete his trials. The path was suggesting led into unknown territory. "We are nothing without the hunt," said again, but this time the words carried a different meaning. Smiled and for the first time thought he understood the expression. "Then let me teach you who you truly are," the human said. "Let me show you what it really means to hunt among the stars." As the twin suns began to set, painting the crystal formations in shades of fire and shadow, made his choice. He retracted his claws and took his first step toward a future he couldn't yet imagine, guided by an alien who had traveled across the galaxy to find him. The watched them with ancient, intelligent eyes, as if it somehow understood that something significant had just changed in the cosmic order. Then it turned and disappeared back into the crystal maze, leaving the young and the human explorer alone with infinite possibilities stretching out before them like an uncharted star map. The hunt was just beginning. 3 months had passed since arrival on, and his life had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. The human had established a small research camp in the crystal formations, using technology that seemed almost magical to the young. Where his people relied on brute force and direct confrontation, employed subtle sensors, adaptive algorithms, and tools that worked with nature rather than against it. "Observation is the foundation of all successful hunting," explained as he adjusted a nearly invisible monitoring device near a migration route. "Your people charge into situations with predetermined strategies based on assumed strengths and weaknesses, but the best predators are those who let their prey teach them how to succeed." Crouched beside the human, his massive frame dwarfing slight build, yet he found himself deferring to the alien's expertise. Over the past weeks, had shown him wonders he never knew existed. The crystal formations weren't just geological structures, but complex ecosystems where energy flowed in patterns that could be read and predicted. The seemingly random movements of prey animals actually followed sophisticated behavioral algorithms that could be decoded with patience and proper observation. But this takes so much time, protested, his instincts still craving direct action. A traditional hunt would have been completed weeks ago. Smiled, that peculiar human expression that was beginning to understand indicated amusement rather than aggression. And what would you have learned from a traditional hunt? How to overpower a single creature? How to prove your dominance through violence? These are lessons any warrior can teach. The monitoring device chimed softly, indicating that one of their target creatures was approaching. Tensed automatically, but remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a small display screen that showed biometric readings from multiple sources. "Tell me what you observe," said quietly. Forced himself to relax and engage his analytical mind rather than his predatory instincts. The approaching was larger than most, probably an alpha male based on the distinctive crest patterns on its armored hide. But something was wrong with its movement patterns. The creature's normal confident stride had been replaced by a halting, uncertain gait. "It's injured," realized. "The left rear appendage shows signs of trauma, but that's not why it's moving strangely." Nodded encouragingly. "Continue." Studied the readings more carefully, cross-referencing them with everything had taught him about behavioral analysis. "It's not just injured, it's afraid, but our apex predators on this world, what could frighten one?" "Excellent question. What do your instruments tell you?" Consulted the various sensors had taught him to interpret. Electromagnetic readings, chemical analyzers, seismic monitors, all painting a picture that traditional senses would have missed entirely. "There's something else in the area, something that doesn't show up on visual scanners but is definitely there." "And what does that suggest to you?" The implications hit like a physical blow. Stealth predators, something that hunts creatures like something so advanced that even our most sophisticated prey animals have evolved to fear it. His expression grew serious. "Now you're beginning to understand why I came looking for you. Your people have built their entire civilization on the assumption that they are the ultimate predators in this galaxy. But what happens when you encounter something that makes you the prey?" Before could respond, their monitoring equipment exploded into frantic activity. Energy readings spiked across multiple spectrums, and the in their observation area suddenly bolted with a speed that its massive size. In the distance, caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't have been possible. Shadows moved independently of their light sources, flowing across the crystal formations like liquid darkness. Whatever was casting them remained invisible to both natural senses and technological scanners, but their effects were undeniable. Plants withered as the shadows passed over them. Crystal formations that had stood for began to crack and crumble. "What in the name of the great hunt is that?" breathed. Was already packing their equipment with practiced efficiency. "That is why I've spent the last 5 years searching for someone like you. That is the enemy your people will face in the coming years, whether they're ready for it or not." "Enemy, but they're just shadows." "Are they?" challenged as he led away from the advancing darkness. "Look at your readings. What do you see?" Forced himself to focus on the data rather than the visceral fear clawing at his mind. The creatures, whatever they were, existed partially in normal space, but extended into dimensions that conventional science couldn't easily measure. They consumed energy directly, not just solar radiation, but the fundamental forces that held matter together. Most terrifying of all, they showed signs of collective intelligence that far exceeded anything in known space. "They're alive," realized with growing horror. "But not like anything we understand. How do you fight something that exists partially outside reality?" "That's exactly the right question," said as they reached his ship. "And it's why the old ways of thinking about predator and prey are becoming obsolete. You can't defeat these beings with claws and teeth. You can't intimidate them with shows of strength. They are to conventional life forms what your people are to single-celled organisms." The ship's hatch sealed behind them as initiated emergency takeoff procedures. Through the viewports, watched the shadows spread across the crystal formations like an infection, leaving withered devastation in their wake. The sight filled him with a terror he had never experienced. The primal fear of a predator suddenly realizing it was being hunted by something infinitely more dangerous. "How many worlds have they attacked?" he asked as they climbed toward orbit. 17 that we know of," replied grimly. "Always the same pattern. They appear without warning, consume everything of value, then disappear back into whatever dimension they call home. No survivors, no witnesses, no way to track them or predict where they'll strike next." "But you survived, how?" was quiet for a long moment as he piloted them away from its atmosphere. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of painful memories. Because I learned to think like prey instead of a predator, I stopped trying to fight them and started trying to understand them. Humans have a saying, if you can't beat them, join them. But sometimes the real wisdom is, if you can't beat them, become something they don't recognize as a threat. The ship reached safe distance from the planet and activated a complex array of scanning equipment that had never seen before. The displays showed from multiple perspectives simultaneously, revealing layers of reality that normal perception couldn't access. The shadow creatures were spreading across the surface like a dark tide, but their movements weren't random. They were searching for something specific. "They're looking for you," said quietly. "Your people's hunting grounds aren't just training areas. They're nodes in a galactic energy network that these creatures use for navigation. Every time a completes a traditional hunt, they strengthen the signal that draws the shadows closer." Felt the foundations of his worldview crumbling. Everything his people valued, everything they had built their civilization upon, was actually making them vulnerable to an enemy they didn't even know existed. "My father, my clan, the hunting grounds where my ancestors proved themselves for generations. Will all be consumed unless we find a way to change the game," finished. "This is why I've been searching for someone like you, someone with the intelligence to understand the problem and the courage to help solve it." "But I'm nobody," protested. "A failed hunter, an embarrassment to my bloodline. What could I possibly do against something like this?" Turned from his controls to face the young directly. "You're asking the wrong question. It's not about what you can do as a traditional hunter. It's about what you can become when you stop limiting yourself to old definitions." The human activated another display, this one showing star charts that spanned half the known galaxy. Red markers indicated worlds that had been attacked by the shadow creatures, while blue markers showed the locations of various species that had contacted over the years. "I've been building a network," he explained. "Representatives from dozens of different species, all working together to understand and counter this threat. Warriors, scientists, philosophers, artists, even criminals and outcasts. The one thing they all have in common is that they were willing to look beyond their species' traditional limitations." Studied the star chart with growing amazement. "You're talking about cooperation between natural enemies, prey species and predator species working together. That's impossible." "Is it? Look at your own relationship with me. 3 months ago, you would have killed me without a second thought. Now you trust me enough to leave your adventure into the unknown. What changed?" The answer was obvious, but saying it out loud felt like admitting to heresy against everything they held sacred. "I learned that there were more important things than proving dominance." "Exactly, and that's the lesson your entire species needs to learn if they want to survive. The shadow creatures aren't just another enemy to be defeated through superior force. They're a catalyst that will force every species in this galaxy to evolve or die." Activated the ship's faster-than-light drive, and the stars around them shifted into the familiar patterns of hyperspace. But instead of heading back toward territory, they were traveling in a direction had never explored. "Where are we going?" "To meet the others. There's a hidden station in the nebula where representatives from various species gather to share information and coordinate responses to shadow incursions. I think it's time you saw what cooperation between former enemies can accomplish." As they traveled through hyperspace, continued education in new forms of hunting. He showed him how information could be more valuable than physical strength, how understanding an enemy's motivations was more important than knowing their weaknesses, and how sometimes the greatest victory was not destroying your opponent, but transforming them into an ally. "Humans have a concept called game theory," explained as they reviewed tactical simulations. "It's the study of strategic decision-making in situations where multiple parties have competing interests. Traditional thinking assumes that all interactions are zero-sum games, where one side's victory requires the other side's defeat." "That's the natural order," replied automatically, though he was beginning to question even his most basic assumptions. "Is it? Consider the ecosystem on your. Predators and prey exist in a complex balance where the success of each depends on the survival of the other. Remove all the prey, and the predators starve. Remove all the predators, and the prey overpopulate and destroy their environment. The system only works when both sides play their roles." The simulation on screen showed various scenarios involving shadow creature encounters. In every case where defenders relied on traditional military tactics, they were quickly overwhelmed. But when different species combined their unique abilities in unexpected ways, they sometimes achieved outcomes that seemed impossible. You're suggesting that the key to defeating the shadow creatures is to work with other species, mused. But how do you convince natural enemies to cooperate? You change the stakes, said simply. When the choice is between setting aside old prejudices and facing extinction, most intelligent species choose survival. The shadow creatures are so far beyond anything we've previously encountered that they're forcing evolutionary leaps that might have taken under normal circumstances. The ship's navigation system chimed, indicating their approach to the nebula. Through the viewports, could see swirling clouds of ionized gas that created one of the most beautiful and dangerous regions of space. Hidden somewhere in that chaotic environment was a station that represented something unprecedented in galactic history. "Are you ready for this?" asked as he began the complex navigation sequence required to safely traverse the nebula. "What you're about to see will challenge everything you thought you knew about the nature of intelligent life in this galaxy." Took a deep breath, tasting the recycled air of the human ship and marveling at how natural it had become. 3 months ago, he had been a failed young hunter desperately trying to prove himself worthy of his heritage. Now he was traveling to a secret meeting of species that supposedly didn't exist, preparing to face an enemy that threatened the very concept of life as they knew it. "I'm ready," he said, and for the first time in his life, he truly meant it. The ship plunged into the swirling chaos of the nebula and prepared to meet his destiny among the stars. Whatever lay ahead, he knew there would be no going back to the simple certainties of his former life. The hunt had become something far more complex and dangerous than anything his ancestors could have imagined. But as it taught him, the greatest predators were those who could adapt to any challenge. It was time to discover what kind of hunter he could truly become. The hidden station materialized out of the nebula's chaotic energy patterns like a dream becoming reality. Pressed against the viewport, staring in wonder at a structure that everything he thought he knew about engineering and physics. The station appeared to be grown rather than built, its organic curves and flowing surfaces suggesting that it was alive in some fundamental way. "Welcome to Haven," said as he guided their ship toward one of several docking bays. "Home to the most unlikely collection of beings in the known galaxy." As they approached, could see other vessels docked at the station. Ships from dozens of different species, their designs ranging from the crystalline perfection of the Etherians to the chaotic metal patchworks favored by the scavenger clans. What made the sight truly remarkable was that many of these species were supposed to be extinct, having been hunted to near extinction by the very empire called home. "How is this possible?" he breathed. "They eliminated the Etherians over a century ago. The scavenger clans were scattered to the void decades before my birth." "Were they?" asked with that mysterious smile. "Or did they simply learn to become invisible to your people's hunting instincts? There's more than one way to survive in a hostile galaxy. Sometimes the best strategy is to let your enemies believe they've already won." The docking bay was a marvel of adaptive technology. The floor and walls seemed to flow like liquid, adjusting their configuration to accommodate each incoming vessel perfectly. Atmospheric processors seamlessly adjusted the environment to suit the needs of whatever species was arriving. Most remarkably of all, everything seemed to operate without any visible control mechanisms or operators. "The station is semi-sentient," explained as they disembarked. "A hybrid of biological and technological systems that can anticipate the needs of its inhabitants. It was originally designed by a species called the Architects, who transcended physical existence about 50,000 years ago. They left it behind as a gift for whoever might need it." As they walked through corridors that adjusted their lighting and atmospheric composition automatically, found himself surrounded by beings he had thought were myths. A delegation of crystalline singers moved past them in perfect harmony, their bodies chiming with musical frequencies that seemed to communicate complex mathematical concepts. A group of shadow walkers flickered in and out of visible existence, their natural phase-shifting abilities making them nearly impossible to track. "These species have been extinct for generations," protested weakly. "My people's military records clearly show their elimination." "Your people's military records show successful hunt completions," corrected. "They show the destruction of and the scattering of populations, but they never accounted for the possibility that some prey might be intelligent enough to fake their own deaths. They entered what appeared to be a vast amphitheater, its walls covered with displays showing star charts, tactical readouts, and real-time monitoring data from across the galaxy. At the center of the space stood a raised platform where representatives from various species were engaged in what seemed to be an intense discussion. Recognized some of them from his military education, but seeing them alive and active was profoundly disorienting. A figure detached itself from the central group and approached them. His hand moved instinctively toward his weapons before he realized who it was. The being stood nearly 3 meters tall, with the distinctive scaled hide and predatory features of but something was different about its bearing and expression. "So this is the young hunter you've been telling us about," the figure said in perfect, though its accent was strange, archaic. "I am Iran, formerly of the 4th Hunting Pack, currently serving as a strategic consultant to this rather unusual alliance." Stared in shock. But how are you here? Why are you working with prey species?" Iran's laugh was bitter. "Prey species? Young one, look around you. These prey species have technology that surpasses our own, strategies that make our military doctrines look like the scribblings of children, and wisdom earned through suffering that our empire has never had to face. Which of us is truly the predator here?" The older led them toward the central platform, where the ongoing discussion became clearer. The beings gathered there weren't just sharing information. They were conducting a complex strategic analysis that took into account dozens of variables that traditional military thinking would never have considered. "Report from the sector," called out a being whose crystalline structure pulsed with internal light. "The shadow incursion has consumed 3 systems in the past week. Their expansion rate is accelerating." "Confirmed," responded what appeared to be a floating cloud of metallic particles. "Our deep space monitors indicate they're approaching the threshold for dimensional cascade failure. If they consume much more energy, they may become capable of existing permanently in our reality." Felt his blood chill. Dimensional cascade failure, what does that mean? Iran's expression was grim. "It means that instead of brief incursions that consume isolated worlds, they'll be able to establish permanent beachheads in our dimension. Once that happens, they won't need to hunt us anymore. We'll simply be food animals in a reality they control." "How much time do we have?" asked as he joined the discussion. A being that resembled a tree made of living metal consulted a complex array of displays. "At current consumption rates, perhaps 6 standard months before they reach critical mass. Less if they encounter any energy-rich civilizations." "Energy-rich civilizations like the Empire," Iran added meaningfully. "Your people's hunting rituals generate exactly the kind of dimensional resonance these creatures feed on. Every successful hunt brings them one step closer to permanent manifestation." The implications hit like a physical blow. "You're saying that every time one of my people proves themselves as a hunter, they're actually helping to destroy our reality." "Not intentionally," said gently. "But yes, that's the cruel irony. The very qualities that made them successful as a species are now serving as a dinner bell for entities that view you as nothing more than a convenient energy source." One of the displays suddenly flared with urgent warnings. A new voice joined the discussion, this one transmitted from a distant location. "Emergency broadcast from the system. Shadow incursion in progress, requesting immediate assistance." The chamber erupted into coordinated activity as various species began implementing what was clearly a well-practiced response protocol. Ships were launched, defense networks activated, and evacuation procedures initiated with an efficiency that put military operations to shame. "How do you coordinate all of this?" asked in amazement. "Dozens of species, each with different technologies and communication methods, working together like a single organism." "Necessity," replied the tree-like being as it processed incoming data streams. "When the alternative is extinction, you learn to overcome philosophical differences very quickly." Led to a smaller observation area where they could watch the response unfold on detailed tactical displays. The rescue operation was unlike anything in military doctrine. Instead of direct confrontation, the Allied forces used hit-and-run tactics designed to confuse and distract the shadow creatures while evacuation procedures saved as many lives as possible. "We learned early that trying to fight them conventionally is suicidal," Iran explained as he joined them. They exist partially outside our dimensional framework, which makes them nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. But they have weaknesses that can be exploited if you understand their nature. What kind of weaknesses? Asked. They're quantum entities, replied. They exist in a state of probability rather than fixed reality. That means they can be influenced by observation and measurement, but only if you approach the problem correctly. On the display, watched as the rescue ships used techniques that seemed almost magical. Instead of energy weapons, they employed devices that altered local space-time geometry. Instead of armor, they relied on phase-shifting technology that made them difficult for the shadow creatures to perceive. Most importantly, they worked together in ways that amplified their individual capabilities exponentially. The Etherians provide dimensional anchor points, Iran narrated as the operation continued. The Shadow Walkers serve as scouts in parallel dimensions. The crystalline singers generate harmonic frequencies that disrupt shadow creature coherence. The scavenger clans provide adaptive technology that can't be predicted or countered. And humans. Humans provide the strategic framework that makes it all work, finished. We're good at seeing patterns and possibilities that other species miss. It's a survival trait we developed long before we reached the stars. The rescue operation succeeded, but barely. The shadow creatures had consumed 3 worlds before the Allied forces managed to disrupt their manifestation enough to force them back into their home dimension. Thousands of lives had been saved, but billions more were gone forever. This is what we face every few weeks, Iran said quietly. And each time they're stronger and more coordinated, we're fighting a delaying action at best. But there might be a way to turn the tide, added, looking directly at. That's why I sought you out specifically. Your people's connection to the energy patterns that attract the shadow creatures could be the key to defeating them permanently. I don't understand. How could our hunting traditions help fight beings like that? Because the same energy resonance that attracts them could potentially be used to trap them, explained the crystalline being who had been monitoring the rescue operation. If properly modulated and amplified, hunting rituals could create dimensional cage that would prevent them from returning to their home dimension. But that would require cooperation from the entire empire, Iran pointed out. Convincing them to work with former prey species and abandon their traditional ways, that might be more impossible than fighting the shadow creatures directly. Felt the weight of enormous responsibility settling on his shoulders. You want me to return to my people and convince them to change everything they believe in. We want you to help them understand that survival sometimes requires evolution, said. They have always been adaptable hunters. Now they need to adapt to hunting an enemy that exists partially outside reality itself. As if summoned by their conversation, a new alarm began sounding throughout the station. The tactical displays showed something that made everyone in the chamber freeze with shock. A massive shadow incursion was forming near the galactic core, larger and more organized than anything they had previously encountered. Estimated manifestation zone includes 17 inhabited systems, reported the mechanical voice of the station's coordination system. Shadow creature density indicates permanent dimensional breach probability of 87%. Including, Iran added grimly as he studied the tactical projections. You're is directly in the path of their expansion. Stared at the display, watching as predictions showed his entire species being consumed by entities they couldn't see, understand, or fight. Everything he had ever known, everyone he had ever cared about, reduced to energy to feed beings that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional reality. How long do we have? He asked quietly. 6 days until they manifest in our dimension, replied. Perhaps 3 days after that before they reach. And you think I can convince my people to abandon everything they believe and work with their traditional enemies in that time? I think you're the only one who has a chance, Iran said. You understand both the old ways and the new possibilities. You've seen what cooperation can accomplish. Most importantly, you've learned that sometimes the greatest hunt requires you to become something you never imagined possible. Looked around the chamber at beings his people had considered extinct, impossible, or irrelevant. Yet here they were, working together to face a threat that dwarfed any challenge the galaxy had previously known. They had set aside centuries of hatred and mistrust because they understood that survival required evolution. What would you need from me? He asked finally. Everything, replied simply. Your knowledge, your connections, your willingness to risk everything you've ever been to become something the galaxy desperately needs. We need you to return to and convince your people that the greatest hunt in their history is about to begin, and it will require them to hunt alongside creatures they once considered prey. The tactical displays continued to show the approaching catastrophe, reality itself preparing to be reshaped by entities that viewed all conventional life as nothing more than convenient energy sources. In 6 days, the shadow creatures would manifest in numbers that could potentially end civilization as they knew it. Unless a failed young hunter could convince an empire of predators to evolve into something unprecedented in galactic history, closed his eyes, and tried to imagine himself explaining to his father, to the clan elders, to the military hierarchy that their only hope for survival lay in working with the very beings they had spent hunting. When he opened his eyes, he found watching him with an expression of quiet confidence. "You can do this," the human said. "I've seen what you're capable of when you stop limiting yourself to old definitions." "The ship is ready when you are," Iran added. "I'll be coming with you. It's time for this old hunter to go home and face whatever consequences await." Nodded slowly, feeling the weight of an entire civilization's future settling on his shoulders. The hunt was about to become something far more complex and dangerous than anything his people had ever imagined. But perhaps that was exactly what they needed to survive. The greatest predators, after all, were those who could adapt to any challenge. It was time to discover what they could become when the very concept of predator and prey became obsolete. The journey back to past intense silence, broken only by the steady stream of increasingly desperate reports from across the galaxy. The shadow creatures had accelerated their timeline, manifesting in multiple systems simultaneously with a coordination that suggested they had learned from previous encounters with the Allied forces. Watch the tactical displays with growing dread as system after system went dark. Each lost world represented billions of lives consumed to fuel entities that existed beyond conventional understanding. Most disturbing of all, the pattern of attacks seemed specifically designed to cut off escape routes and isolate potential resistance centers. "They're learning," Iran observed grimly as he studied the invasion patterns. "Each incursion is more sophisticated than the last. They're not just consuming energy anymore, they're studying us." Nodded from the pilot's seat, his hands dancing across controls that guided their ship through hyperspace corridors that were becoming increasingly unstable. "It's what any intelligent predator would do. Study your prey, learn their weaknesses, adapt your hunting strategies accordingly." "But we're not dealing with conventional predators," protested. "These are entities from another dimension entirely. How can they possibly understand our psychology well enough to manipulate our responses?" "Energy patterns," replied Iran. "Every thought, every emotion, every decision generates distinctive energy signatures. They don't need to understand our minds the way we do. They just need to recognize the patterns that indicate fear, desperation, and the breakdown of coordinated resistance." The ship suddenly shuddered as they encountered a distortion field that hadn't existed when they started their journey. Through the viewports, could see space itself rippling like water, reality bending in ways that hurt to observe directly. In the distance, a massive shadow creature was feeding on the energy released by a collapsing star, growing larger and more substantial with each passing moment. "By the great hunt," breathed, "it's the size of a moon." "And getting bigger," confirmed as he adjusted their course to avoid the feeding zone. "At this rate, some of them will achieve permanent physical manifestation within days rather than weeks." As they approached, the scope of the crisis became undeniably clear. The planet's orbital defense platforms were active and alert, their massive weapons trained on empty space, as if expecting an attack that sensors couldn't detect. Communication channels buzzed with confused reports from military commanders who were detecting energy signatures that matched no known threat profile. "This is Hunter Prime and requesting immediate identification," came a familiar voice over the communication system. "Unknown vessel, you are entering restricted space during a military alert. Identify yourself immediately or be destroyed." Felt his throat tighten with emotion. His father's voice carried the same note of controlled aggression that had terrified him as a cub, but now he could also hear the underlying confusion and fear. The greatest military force in known space was facing an enemy they couldn't see, understand, or fight. Father responded, his voice carrying across the void between ships. It's me. I've returned and I've brought allies who can help us face what's coming. The silence that followed was so complete that wondered if the communication system had failed. When finally spoke again, his voice carried a mixture of relief, anger, and disbelief that spoke volumes about the stress the military leadership was under. You disappeared months ago, and now you return during the greatest crisis in our history. And what do you mean by allies? Our sensors show only a single small vessel. Permission to dock at the primary military station, Iran interjected, his voice carrying the authority of senior military rank. This is Iran, formerly of the 4th Hunting Pack, current strategic consultant to the Dimensional Defense Alliance. We have critical information about the current threat. Another long pause, followed by frantic communications between multiple military units. The name Iran was legendary in military circles, but he had been declared dead over a decade ago after disappearing during a deep space reconnaissance mission. Iran's voice was barely controlled. Impossible, you were lost in the void wars, we held funeral rites. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, Iran replied with dark humor. I found something more interesting than dying, Hunter Prime. I found a way to save our species from extinction. The orbital defenses parted to allow their passage, but could see that they were being escorted by no fewer than 12 heavy cruisers. As they approached the main military station, he was amazed to see the level of activity around what was normally a routine administrative center. Ships from across the empire were converging on, creating the largest military concentration in recorded history. They know something is wrong, observed as he guided their ship toward the designated docking bay. Even if they can't identify the specific threat, their instincts are telling them that this is different from anything they've faced before. The docking bay was a chaos of activity as military personnel rushed to prepare for a war they didn't understand. Could see the strain in their movements, the way they checked and rechecked equipment that had never failed them before but somehow felt inadequate for the challenge ahead. As soon as they disembarked, they were surrounded by an honor guard that managed to be both respectful and threatening. At the center of the formation stood Hunter Prime and his father, wearing full ceremonial armor that emphasized his massive frame and predatory grace. For a moment, father and son simply stared at each other across a gap that seemed to encompass more than just physical distance. Saw his own features reflected in the older's face, but also noted the new lines of stress and the haunted expression that spoke of facing problems that raw force couldn't solve. My son, and said finally, his voice carefully neutral, you have chosen an interesting time to return home. I've come because our people need to understand what they're facing, replied, forcing himself to meet his father's gaze directly. And because I've learned things that could save us all. An's eyes shifted to Iran, and his expression became unreadable. You bring the ghost of a dead hero to support your claims? This human beside you smells of alien technology and strange philosophies. What kind of allies are these? The kind that have been fighting the shadow creatures for years, answered before anyone else could speak. The kind that have developed strategies and technologies that work against enemies that exist partially outside our reality. The kind that could teach us how to hunt something that makes us look like helpless prey animals. The words hit the assembled like physical blows. To suggest that there was anything in the universe that could make the dominant predator species look like prey was tantamount to blasphemy. Several of the honor guard moved their hands closer to their weapons and could see his father's control beginning to slip. Explain yourself, and growled. What are these shadow creatures you speak of? Our best scientists detect energy signatures that match no known phenomenon, but they're hardly the universe-ending threat you seem to imply. Stepped forward, his small frame dwarfed by the surrounding, but his presence somehow commanding attention anyway. Hunter Prime, with your permission, I'd like to show you something that will clarify the situation considerably. He activated a portable holographic projector that filled the docking bay with three-dimensional displays showing the current state of the galaxy. Red zones indicated areas where shadow incursions were in progress, while yellow zones showed regions that had been completely consumed. The amount of red and yellow on the display was staggering. 17 star systems have been completely consumed in the past week, explained calmly. The energy signatures your scientists are detecting are the precursors to a dimensional manifestation that will make you the next target. Impossible, declared one of the assembled military advisors. No force in the known universe could consume entire star systems in a matter of days. Iran activated his own equipment, adding layers of detailed tactical data to display. Not impossible, just beyond your current understanding of what constitutes a military threat. These beings exist primarily in dimensions parallel to our own, which makes them effectively invulnerable to conventional weapons. But they're vulnerable to coordinated dimensional manipulation using techniques that multiple species working together can accomplish, added, drawing on everything he had learned during his time at Haven. The same energy patterns that your hunting rituals generate can be used to trap them, but only if every major hunting ground in the Empire participates simultaneously. The implications of what he was suggesting began to dawn on the assembled military leadership. To coordinate every hunting ground in the Empire would require cooperation and communication on a scale that had never been attempted. More challenging still, it would require abandoning the traditional competitive nature of society in favor of unprecedented collaboration. You're suggesting that we transform our most sacred rituals into weapons, and said slowly, and that we coordinate with prey species to accomplish this. I'm suggesting that we evolve or die, replied bluntly. The shadow creatures are to us what we are to the creatures we traditionally hunt. Unless we learn to think and act in ways that transcend our current limitations, our empire will be nothing but energy to fuel their expansion into permanent reality. A new alarm began sounding throughout the station, and the holographic displays updated with fresh data that made everyone in the docking bay freeze with shock. A massive distortion was forming at the edge of the system, larger and more stable than any previous manifestation. Estimated manifestation time, 14 hours, reported the station's tactical officer. Shadow creature density indicates this will be a permanent incursion. Once established, they'll be able to exist indefinitely in our dimension. And stared at the displays with the expression of a predator who had suddenly realized he was being hunted by something far more dangerous than himself. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual authority. 14 hours to prepare for an enemy we can't see, can't understand, and can't fight using any known methods. He looked directly at his son. What do you propose we do? We implement the emergency protocols that the Dimensional Defense Alliance has been developing for exactly this situation, replied. We coordinate with every allied species that can contribute to a dimensional cage large enough to trap the incoming incursion. And we transform every hunting ground in the Empire into a node in the largest trap in galactic history. And if this fails? Looked around at the assembled military leadership, these proud predators who had built the greatest empire in known space through the application of overwhelming force and individual excellence. Now they needed to learn that sometimes the greatest hunt required setting aside everything you thought you knew about strength and dominance. If this fails, then at least we'll die as hunters rather than prey, he said simply. But I don't think it will fail, because I've learned something important during my time away from home. And what is that? Anne asked. That the greatest predators aren't those who can defeat any single enemy. They're those who can adapt to hunt anything the universe throws at them, including entities that exist partially outside reality itself. Smiled, that strange human expression that had learned indicated approval and confidence. Your son has become quite the hunter, Hunter Prime, perhaps not in the traditional sense, but in ways that might save your entire species. As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, another wave of distortion rippled through space around the station. Reality itself was beginning to buckle under the pressure of entities that were forcing their way into a dimension that was never meant to contain them. The hunt was about to begin, but it would be unlike anything they had ever imagined. Instead of individual prowess, it would require unprecedented cooperation. Instead of overwhelming force, it would require subtle manipulation of energies that existed beyond normal perception. Instead of dominating their prey, they would need to work alongside former enemies to trap something that viewed all conventional life as nothing more than convenient energy sources. Looked at his father, seeing the moment when the greatest hunter in history realized that everything he knew about hunting was about to become obsolete. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Gather the pack leaders, and said finally, If we're going to attempt something this unprecedented, we'll need every hunter in the Empire working in perfect coordination. The transformation was beginning. 12 hours remained until the shadow creatures achieved permanent manifestation in their reality, and the command center of had been transformed into something that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. Representatives from dozens of species worked alongside military commanders, their different technologies and perspectives combining to create a defense network that spanned half the galaxy. Stood before the central tactical display, watching as status reports flowed in from hunting grounds across the Empire. Each sacred site was being modified according to specifications provided by the Dimensional Defense Alliance, ancient ritual circles rewired with technology that existed at the intersection of physics and metaphysics. "Or a hunting ground reports full conversion completed," announced a junior officer, her voice carrying the strain of someone who had been working without sleep for the past day. "Energy resonance patterns are stable and locked into the primary network." "Acknowledged," replied, marking another node as active on the galactic map. Hundreds of similar confirmations had been streaming in as pack leaders across the Empire struggled to understand and implement modifications to rituals that had remained unchanged for. At first, the resistance had been overwhelming. Pack leaders had refused to allow aliens to modify their sacred hunting grounds. Military commanders had balked at coordinating with species they had spent their careers hunting to extinction. The religious hierarchy had denounced the entire plan as blasphemy against the fundamental nature of existence. But as reports of approaching shadow creatures continued to pour in, and as the scope of the threat became undeniable, pragmatism had gradually overcome tradition. The choice had become simple: evolve or face extinction. "Status report from the Etherian Coordination Network," called out one of the crystalline beings who had arrived from Haven to assist with the defense preparations. "Dimensional anchor points are established and holding steady. We're detecting increasing instability in the target manifestation zone." Appeared beside, his human features showing the exhaustion that came from 12 hours of continuous coordination between species that had never worked together before. "The shadow creatures are adapting to our preparations," he reported quietly. "They're attempting to manifest earlier than predicted, probably to avoid giving us time to complete the trap." "How much earlier?" asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. 3 hours, maybe less. The dimensional barriers are deteriorating faster than our models predicted." Looked around the command center at beings who represented the most unlikely alliance in galactic history. Shadow walkers provided intelligence from parallel dimensions where the creatures were already manifesting. Scavenger clans contributed adaptive technologies that could respond to changing conditions in real time. The tree-like botanists offered organic computing networks that could process the massive data flows required for galactic-scale coordination. Most remarkably of all, it was working. Despite centuries of mutual distrust and predator-prey relationships, these species had found ways to combine their abilities into something far greater than the sum of their parts. "Final network synchronization in 30 minutes, announced Iran from his position at the primary coordination console. The old warrior had thrown himself into the technical aspects of the operation with an enthusiasm that reminded why he had once been considered the greatest tactical mind in the military. "All hunting ground modifications must be completed by then, or the entire network will fail," added a floating cloud of metallic particles that served as the voice of a distributed intelligence species. "Dimensional resonance requires perfect synchronization across light years of space." Hunter Priman approached the central display, his massive frame moving with the controlled grace of a predator who had finally found worthy prey. Over the past 12 hours, had watched his father transform from a confused military commander into something approaching the leader this unprecedented situation required. "Pack leader or reports resistance from the religious authorities at the Crimson Peaks hunting ground," and announced. "They're refusing to allow the modifications, claiming that altering the sacred circles will anger the spirits of ancient hunters." "How far are we from achieving minimum network density?" asked, consulting the tactical projections. "We need at least 85% of the major hunting grounds active to create a dimensional cage large enough to contain the incoming manifestation," replied one of the Etherian technicians. "We're currently at 78%. "Not enough," said grimly, and we're running out of time to convince the holdouts. An alarm suddenly pierced the air of the command center, and every display in the room flared with urgent warnings. The shadow creatures had abandoned all pretense of gradual manifestation and were forcing their way into reality through sheer application of gathered energy. Dimensional breach forming at coordinates 77 Alpha, reported the tactical officer. Multiple large-scale manifestations detected. Estimated time to full reality integration, 47 minutes. The central display showed what was emerging from the distortion zone, and several of the assembled beings made sounds of shock or fear. The shadow creatures weren't arriving individually anymore. They were manifesting as a coordinated swarm that moved with the precision of a military formation. "They've been studying us even more carefully than we realized," observed Iran. "This isn't just an invasion, it's a sophisticated military operation designed to counter our defensive preparations." "Can we adjust the network to compensate?" asked. "Not without the remaining hunting grounds," replied the Etherian coordinator. "The mathematics are unforgiving. We need total cooperation or the entire plan fails." Stared at the display, watching as reality itself bent under the pressure of entities forcing their way into a dimension that couldn't naturally contain them. In less than an hour, his would become the feeding ground for beings that existed beyond conventional understanding. "I need to speak with the holdout pack leaders directly," he said finally. "There's no time for extended negotiations," pointed out. "By the time we establish communications and explain the situation again, the manifestation will be complete." "Then I won't explain, I'll show them." Activated the holographic communication system, establishing simultaneous contact with all the hunting grounds that were still refusing to participate in the network. The faces that appeared were those of pack leaders he had known since childhood, warriors whose dedication to tradition was matched only by their skill in the hunt. "Pack leaders," he began, his voice carrying the authority he had never possessed as a failed young hunter. "I know you're being asked to do something that seems to violate everything we've always believed, but I want you to look at something." He transferred the tactical display to their communication channels, showing them the approaching swarm of shadow creatures in all their terrifying detail. "This is what's coming for us. This is what will consume our hunting grounds, our entire civilization unless we act now." "Impossible," declared Pack Leader, or his face showing the skepticism that came from a lifetime of facing conventional enemies. "No creature could grow to such size or coordinate such complex movements." "You're right," agreed. "No creature as we understand them could accomplish this. But these aren't creatures in any sense we recognize. They're entities from dimensions where the laws of physics work differently, where energy and matter are just suggestions rather than absolute rules." He activated another display, this one showing the consumption of an entire star system by shadow creatures that had achieved permanent manifestation in another sector. The beings watching could see worlds being drained of energy, their very atoms unraveling as they were converted into fuel for entities that existed partially outside reality. "This is our future if we fail," continued. "But we have a chance to trap them, to force them back into their own dimension before they can establish a permanent foothold in ours. The only requirement is that every major hunting ground in the Empire participate in a coordinated energy resonance that will create a dimensional cage." "You ask us to pervert our most sacred rituals," protested another pack leader. "To work with prey species that we've spent centuries eliminating. How can this be the path of honor?" "Because honor means nothing to the dead," replied bluntly. "Because the greatest hunt in our history requires us to hunt something that makes us look like prey animals. Because sometimes evolution means abandoning comfortable certainties in favor of survival." He paused, looking directly at each of the pack leaders through their communication links. "I've seen what these shadow creatures can do. I've watched them consume entire civilizations in a matter of hours. I've also seen what becomes possible when former enemies work together against a threat that dwarfs all their previous conflicts." "Show them the Alliance in action," suggested quietly. Transferred feeds from Haven, showing the pack leaders the unprecedented cooperation between species that had been at war for generations. They could see Etherian dimensional specialists working alongside tactical officers. Shadow walkers coordinating with crystalline singers to map probability cascades across multiple dimensions. human strategic analysts integrating input from dozens of different perspectives into coherent battle plans. "This is what we've learned to become," he explained. "Not prey working with predators, but hunters who understand that some quarry requires coordination beyond anything we've previously imagined. The shadow creatures are to us what we are to the creatures we traditionally hunt. Unless we become something greater than our individual capabilities, we'll be consumed just as easily." The communication feeds showed pack leaders consulting with their advisors, their expressions shifting as they began to understand the scope of what they were facing. In the background, alarms continued to sound as the shadow manifestation approached critical thresholds. 23 minutes until full reality integration," announced the tactical officer. "Pack leader Orr," said urgently, "you've known me since I was a cub. You watched me fail at every traditional hunting trial. But I'm asking you to trust that I've finally learned what it means to be a real hunter." The old pack leader stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone making a decision that would define the future of his species. "Modify the Crimson Peak's hunting ground according to Alliance specifications," he commanded his subordinates. "If Young has truly learned to hunt, then perhaps it's time for the rest of us to learn as well." One by one, the remaining pack leaders gave similar orders. Sacred hunting grounds that had remained unchanged were rapidly converted into nodes in a defensive network that spanned the galaxy. The modifications weren't just technological, they were philosophical, representing a fundamental shift in how they understood their place in the universe. "Network synchronization achieved," announced Iran as the final hunting grounds came online. "All nodes are active and coordinating according to specifications." "Dimensional anchor points stable," added the Etherian coordinator. "Energy resonance patterns are building toward convergence." On the tactical display, could see the trap taking shape. Invisible lines of force connected hunting grounds across the Empire, creating a web of energy that existed partially outside normal space-time. At the center of the web, the approaching shadow creatures were beginning to show signs of confusion as their usual navigation methods became unreliable. "They're detecting the dimensional distortions," observed. "They're trying to alter course to avoid the trap." "Too late," replied the distributed intelligence network. "Once the manifestation process reaches critical threshold, they can't change trajectory without risking complete energy dissipation." The shadow creatures had been caught between dimensions, no longer able to retreat to their home reality, but unable to fully manifest in normal space. The dimensional cage was working exactly as designed, creating a prison that existed in the spaces between realities. But the battle wasn't over yet. Trapped and increasingly desperate, the shadow creatures began to radiate massive amounts of energy in all directions, attempting to overload the cage that contained them. "Network strain approaching critical levels," warned one of the monitoring stations. "Energy feedback is building beyond safe parameters." "All hunting grounds, begin ritual coordination sequence," and commanded, his voice carrying across the galaxy to pack leaders who had never worked together before. "Let the shadow creatures learn what it means to hunt as a unified pack." What followed was unprecedented in history. From across the Empire, hundreds of pack leaders began performing hunting rituals in perfect synchronization, their individual efforts combining into a collective energy pattern that reinforced the dimensional cage. Ancient,